Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the introduction from the good representative on a summary of the resolution before us. I guess I take, just in comments of introductory comments, the use of the $4 billion of surplus that we have as an indication of the economic health of our state is actually the least best indicator of the economy and the health of the state. That is actually a result, frankly, of fiscal policy that generated revenue that we didn't need, to put it bluntly. It is more money than we needed to run the state. The better indication across the board is how are the people, the workers, the families in this state doing? Has nothing to do with that. In fact, that is the worst indicator, frankly, of the health of the economy. When you look out at small and medium-sized businesses across this state, they're struggling to find employees. That's an indicator of the health of our economy. They are increasing the amount of pay that they're offering and still not able to generate people coming in the door to apply for their jobs. That is an indicator of the health of the economy. When you look at gas prices over the last year that have significantly increased, affecting the disposable income of families across the state, that is a better indicator of the health of our economy. So I would argue that just because we find ourselves with a $4 billion projected surplus, that is not the best indicator of the health of the economy. And I think the phrase was the best economy I've seen in the entire time in the legislature. And I would argue, as I said, that's the least best indicator, and that we find ourselves really in troubling times economically. And I think the second point I'd make in the introduction before I get to questions is the obligation of SEBAC, that we now have an obligation to make the actuarially required payment, and that SEBAC was the impetus for that. If timing is correct, if my memory serves correct, I believe SEBAC was initiated in 1997, but it was not until Governor Malloy came into office in 2010 that this legislature, in his commitment to make the actuarial payment, we actually did that. And that would have been in 2011. So the first 14 years was hit and miss, whether we actually complied with the agreement that we made with state employees in this state to make the actual payment. So while I agree with the assertion that we did not fund our retirement systems, that is a little misleading when you go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Because every defined benefit plan in the country was what they called pay-as-you-go, which meant you paid out of the resources you had that year. Private sector, public sector mattered not. And it wasn't until the early 70s when ERISA was passed at the federal level that the private sector had to comply and have actuarial statements. And then what did we find? By the time it got to the 1980s, the private sector realized those defined benefit plans were unsustainable. And how do we know that? That was the advent of the 401k. And when you go look out in the private sector, you do not see defined benefit plans broadly. You see a 401k style plan. It could be a 457, could be other styles, but it is an employee-employer match basis generally. The only place you effectively find defined benefit plans anymore is in state and municipal government. And when we look across our state here in Connecticut, what we're seeing is a transition. The state is kind of out of line with our municipal governments. They have actually negotiated over time with their union members in their towns, their town employees, to move away from defined benefit because they've realized the same thing that the private sector has. Defined benefit plans are unsustainable. They're unaffordable. The difference between the private sector and the public sector, generally, is the private sector has a limit on what they can offer in an agreement between their employees and the company. And that limit is the survival of the company. If the management offers more than they can afford, to their employees, the business could go out of business and no longer exist, which serves nobody. When you contrast that with the public sector, the people paying the bill are the taxpayers. And this ability to pay, while not infinite, is not constrained by an existence because the state of Connecticut effectively cannot go out of business. And so if we need more money to pay for an agreement that is negotiated between state employees and the state government, we just raise taxes. And that is one other difference between the negotiation process. When you look at who is represented at the table in a private sector negotiation between employees and management in the private sector, the people paying the bill are sitting at the table. Management is represented at the table, and they're paying the bill. And so when they're negotiating, they're speaking from a position of responsibility for that payment. In the public sector, when you negotiate between state employees and the administration, the people paying the bill are not sitting at the table. The taxpayers are not sitting at the table. And that is one other difference in the process. So I go back to this assertion that when we say the SEBAC agreement is the obligation to make the actual required payment, we've only been doing that for about the last 10 years. So even though, as I go back in history, these agreements have been in place for decades, it wasn't until the 70s the private sector took ownership and started doing actuarial assessments as obligated by federal law. And it wasn't until in the 90s we started talking about that at the state level, but it was still over a decade before we showed the discipline, frankly, as a legislator to honor the agreements that were made with our state employees to fund the actual required payment, which would put us further behind the curve, and we're still recovering from that today. So while I would agree with the assertion that this contract doesn't directly impact the unfunded liability because that is based on past employees and past actions of the legislature, it does have an impact on the future costs and the actual required payments to fund the pension liability that is coming forward.